There are moments when the universe holds its breath, waiting to see if you'll break or become something harder. For Lieutenant Daniel Harper, that moment came when he watched his homeworld ignored by every civilization that claimed to value life. Earth had sent 14 distress signals across known space, beacons screaming into the void as resource wars tore continents apart, and toxic clouds choked entire hemispheres. Not one species answered. Not because they couldn't hear us, but because they had already decided we weren't worth saving. Daniel stood on the observation deck of the Resolute, Earth's first deep space reconnaissance vessel, cobbled together from stolen blueprints and desperation. Beside him was his navigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Rita Vasquez who had lost her entire family to the flooding of coastal cities. Behind them, Chief Engineer Paulo Reeves adjusted the reactor core with hands that trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. They were survivors of a planet the galaxy had written off as another failed experiment in sentience. The ship hummed. Beneath their feet, a patchwork of human ingenuity and salvaged alien tech that shouldn't have worked but did because failure wasn't an option. They had been tracking a Crovar merchant vessel for 3 weeks, watching it haul precious water synthesizers to a dozen worlds while Earth's children drank from poisoned wells. The Crovar were one of the founding members of the Celestial Assembly, a coalition of advanced species who claimed to govern with wisdom and compassion. That compassion, Daniel had learned, extended only to those they deemed civilized. Rita broke the silence, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had stopped believing in mercy. The Crovar ship is changing course. They're heading toward the Fringe territories. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. The Fringe was lawless space, where pirates and exiles carved out brutal kingdoms beyond assembly oversight. It was also where Earth had secretly established 3 colonies, settlements of refugees, and rebels who refused to die quietly on a poisoned world. If the Crovar were heading there, it wasn't for trade. Paulo looked up from his console, grease staining his weathered face. They're not alone. I'm picking up 5 escort ships, military-grade shields and weapons. This isn't a merchant run. Daniel's jaw tightened. The Assembly had always claimed neutrality regarding Earth's struggles, insisting they couldn't interfere with natural planetary development. But neutrality was a lie wrapped in bureaucracy. They hadn't intervened because humans were messy, emotional, and worst of all, unpredictable. Species that couldn't be controlled were better left to extinction. Yet here they were, mobilizing military assets toward human colonies that officially didn't exist. "Get me a channel to Colony Jericho," Daniel ordered. Rita's fingers flew across her station. But after several tense moments, she shook her head. Nothing. Either they're maintaining radio silence or something's jamming their communications. The Resolute had been built for reconnaissance, not combat. Its weapon systems were rudimentary at best, designed to ward off pirates rather than engage military vessels. Taking on 6 ships was suicide, and Daniel knew it. But the alternative was letting those ships reach Jericho unchallenged, and he had already watched his world die in silence. He wouldn't let another human settlement fall without a fight. Paulo seemed to read his thoughts. The reactor can handle a full burn for maybe 20 minutes before we risk meltdown. After that, we're dead in space. 20 minutes, Daniel repeated, his mind already calculating trajectories and attack vectors. Rita, how long until they reach Jericho? 3 hours at their current speed. She paused, then added quietly, "We won't make it in time to warn them." "Then we don't warn them," Daniel said, his voice carrying a finality that silenced the deck. "We stop the threat before it arrives." Rita turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the same grim acceptance that had kept them alive this long. "You want to engage 6 military vessels with a ship held together by spare parts and spite?" Daniel allowed himself a thin smile. Spite's gotten us this far. The next hour was spent in frantic preparation. Paulo rerouted every non-essential system to weapons and shields, turning the Resolute into a flying bomb with just enough protection to maybe survive the first volley. Rita plotted an intercept course that would bring them into the Crovar formation at maximum velocity, giving them the element of surprise, but eliminating any chance of retreat. Daniel reviewed everything he knew about Crovar tactics, which wasn't much beyond the fact that they relied heavily on shield technology and rarely expected anyone to fight back. As they approached weapons range, Daniel opened a channel to his crew. All 7 of them scattered throughout the ship in positions they had trained for, but never expected to use. This is Lieutenant Harper. In a few minutes, we're going to do something that every tactical manual says is impossible. We're going to make 6 warships regret underestimating Earth. Some of you might think this is revenge, and maybe it is. But it's more than that. Every time we let them act without consequence, we tell the galaxy that human lives don't matter. Today we change that message. Today we show them that ignoring us has a cost. The channel stayed silent, but Daniel felt their resolve through the ship's bulkheads. These weren't soldiers trained in prestigious academies. They were mechanics, miners and refugees who had learned to fight because the universe gave them no other choice. Rita's voice cut through his thoughts. Entering weapons range in 30 seconds. Crovar ships are maintaining formation. They don't see us yet. Paolo's update followed immediately. All power diverted to forward cannons. Shields at maximum. May whatever god you believe in have mercy on us, because they sure as hell won't. Daniel gripped the command chair, feeling the ship vibrate with barely contained energy. He thought about Jericho, about the families who had risked everything to build new lives in the void. He thought about Earth, slowly dying while the galaxy watched with clinical detachment. He thought about every unanswered distress call, every denied request for aid, every diplomatic channel that led nowhere. Fire, he commanded. The Resolute's forward cannons erupted in brilliant streams of superheated plasma, crude and violent compared to elegant alien weaponry, but devastatingly effective at close range. The lead Crovar escort never had time to raise its shields. The blast punched through its hull, triggering a cascade of explosions that tore the ship apart from the inside. Debris scattered across space like burning stars. The remaining ships, scattered in confusion, their formations breaking as alarms shrieked through their corridors. They had expected patrol routes and merchant escorts, not a suicidal human vessel willing to trade its life for theirs. That confusion bought Daniel precious seconds. Rita, evasive pattern Delta. Paolo, charge the main cannon again. Daniel's commands came fast and precise. We've got their attention. Now let's keep it. The Crovar recovered quickly, their military discipline overcoming initial shock. Return fire lit up the darkness, energy bolts that could vaporize asteroids converging on the Resolute's position. Rita threw the ship into a violent spin, dodging some blasts while others hammered against failing shields. The deck lurched beneath them, lights flickering as systems struggled to compensate. Shield integrity at 40%. Paolo shouted over the chaos. We can't take many more hits. Daniel's response was cut short as another volley struck home, this time breaching the outer hull near the engine room. Alarms screamed. Somewhere below, he heard the hiss of escaping atmosphere before emergency bulkheads slammed shut. One of his crew, a young technician named Robert Chen who had joined them just 3 weeks ago, didn't make it out of that section. They had drawn first blood, but the cost was already mounting. 5 Crovar ships remained, circling like predators who had finally recognized their prey as dangerous. The merchant vessel hung back, protected by its escorts, likely transmitting everything back to assembly command. Good, Daniel thought grimly. Let them watch. Let them see what happens when you push humanity too far. The battle raged on, a desperate dance of fire and fury that neither side could win cleanly. The Resolute was outgunned and outmatched, but Daniel had one advantage the Crovar couldn't comprehend. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous thing in the void. The Resolute shuddered as another blast tore through its starboard plating, sending sparks cascading across the bridge. Daniel tasted copper in his mouth, realized he had bitten through his lip during the last impact. Blood and fire, he thought distantly, seemed to be the only language the universe understood when humans spoke. Rita's console exploded in a shower of glass and flame. She threw herself backward, her left arm smoking where shrapnel had sliced through her flight suit. Before Daniel could move, she was back at her station, using her good hand to reroute navigation through secondary systems. Her face was pale, but her voice remained steady. 2 ships down, 3 still active. The merchant vessel is trying to break away. Let it run, Daniel growled. I want those fighters to know they bled here. Paolo, status on the main cannon. The chief engineer's response came through gritted teeth. 30 seconds until we can fire again. But Commander, the reactor temperature is approaching critical. We're running on borrowed time. Time was something Daniel had stopped believing in the moment Earth sent its first unanswered distress call. He watched the tactical display, saw the 3 remaining Crovar escorts adjusting their formation, preparing for a coordinated strike that would overwhelm the Resolute's failing shields. They were learning, adapting to human unpredictability with military precision. In another life, he might have admired their efficiency. The communication array crackled to life with a transmission from the lead Crovar vessel. The voice that emerged was synthesized, emotionless, carrying the weight of species who had forgotten what desperation felt like. Human vessel, you have committed an act of war against the Celestial Assembly. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. You will be granted a swift trial before execution. Daniel felt something break inside him. Not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of their words. They killed his world through indifference, murdered Jericho's future with their warships, and now offered him a trial, as if justice meant anything in a galaxy built on selective compassion. He opened a return channel, his voice carrying across the void with a clarity that surprised even himself. This is Lieutenant Daniel Harper of Earth, a planet your assembly deemed unworthy of saving while our children drowned and starved. You want to talk about acts of war? You committed genocide through silence. You watched us die and called it natural development. So here's my response to your trial, your assembly, and every species that turned away when we screamed for help. Paolo's voice cut in. Main cannon charged. Daniel's finger hovered over the firing control. Tell the galaxy that humans don't die quietly anymore. The cannon discharged with enough force to push the Resolute backward, its reactor screaming in protest as it channeled every remaining ounce of power into a single devastating blast. The beam caught the lead Crovar escort dead center, burning through its shields like they were made of paper. The ship split in half, its reactor detonating in a brilliant flash that momentarily turned night into day. But victory came with a price. The reactor overload Daniel had been dreading finally arrived. Paolo's console lit up red across every indicator. Reactor breach imminent. All hands abandon ship protocols. We have maybe 5 minutes. The 2 remaining Crovar vessels sensed blood in the water. They closed in, weapons charging for a killing blow. Rita tried to maneuver, but the Resolute's engines were failing, responding sluggishly to her commands. They were dead in space, waiting for the executioner's strike. Then something impossible happened. A new contact appeared on the tactical display, emerging from the shadow of a nearby asteroid field. Then another, and another. Within seconds, 15 ships surrounded the battlefield, their hulls marked with symbols Daniel recognized instantly. These weren't official Earth vessels. They were colony ships, civilian transports retrofitted with whatever weapons their crews could salvage or build. Miners, traders, refugees who had been listening to the fight and decided that if one human ship could stand against the assembly, they would stand together. The lead ship opened a channel. Lieutenant Harper, this is Captain Yuki Tanaka of the mining vessel Defiant. We heard your transmission. Jericho heard it too. They're evacuating now, but they wanted you to know something. You bought them time. You made the galaxy see us. Daniel felt his throat tighten. These weren't soldiers. They were families, people who had already lost everything once and were willing to risk it all again. He wanted to tell them to run, to save themselves, but the words died before reaching his lips because he understood. This wasn't about tactics or survival anymore. This was about refusing to disappear without being witnessed. The Crovar vessels hesitated, their tactical processors likely calculating new odds. 15 ships against 2, even civilian vessels, changed the equation dramatically. The merchant ship that had been fleeing earlier began transmitting on all frequencies, its message reaching deep into assembly space. This is Crovar Merchant Captain Thelos. I am witnessing an unprovoked human assault. Multiple vessels. Request immediate military response. But something else was happening on those frequencies, something the Crovar captain hadn't anticipated. Other voices began cutting through his transmission. Independent traders, neutral species, even some assembly members who had grown uncomfortable with the official narrative. They had watched the battle through intercepted feeds. They had heard Daniel's words. And more importantly, they had heard the silence that followed Earth's years of desperate calls. A Valorian diplomat's voice, trembling with either fear or conviction, broke through the chatter. This is Diplomatic Attaché Cuven of the Valorian Embassy. I submit for the record that Earth's distress signals were logged and deliberately suppressed by Assembly vote 7 years ago. The human accusation of genocide through inaction has legal merit under Assembly Law Section 4, Paragraph 12, regarding species preservation protocols. The channel erupted into chaos. Accusations, denials, demands for evidence. The carefully maintained facade of Assembly righteousness cracked under the weight of one inconvenient truth. They hadn't just ignored Earth, they had actively chosen to let humanity die. The remaining Krovar vessels broke formation and retreated, not from military defeat but from something far more dangerous to their carefully ordered galaxy. They fled from accountability, from questions they couldn't answer without admitting their complicity. Captain Tanaka's voice returned, now carrying an edge of grim satisfaction. Lieutenant, the Krovar are running. Jericho confirms full evacuation. They're naming their new settlement Harper's Stand. Thought you should know. Daniel slumped in his chair, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. Around him, the Resolute groaned like a dying animal. Paolo was already coordinating evacuation, getting the surviving crew to escape pods. Rita sat at her ruined console, her injured arm cradled against her chest, and for the first time since the battle began, she smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "Not yet," Daniel replied, though his voice carried no conviction. The Assembly would regroup, spin narratives, find ways to maintain control. But something had shifted. The galaxy had watched humans refuse to die quietly, watched civilian ships stand against military vessels, watched a crew choose sacrifice over submission. That image would spread, carried by traitors and diplomats and species who had their own grievances against Assembly authority. As escape pods launched from the dying Resolute, Daniel took one last look at the bridge that had been his home for 3 years. Blood stained the deck where Robert Chen had died. Scorch marks blackened walls where Rita's console had exploded. Every surface carried scars from a battle that should never have been necessary. Paolo appeared at his shoulder, emergency kit in hand. "Time to go, Commander. She's held together this long because you asked her to. Don't make her die alone." Daniel nodded, following his chief engineer toward the escape pods. But before sealing the hatch, he activated the ship-wide communication one final time. "This is Harper. The Resolute served us well. She wasn't built for war, but she fought like she was born for it. Remember that when they try to tell you humans can't stand against the galaxy. Remember that 7 people in a broken ship made an entire Assembly fleet retreat. Remember that we didn't ask for permission to matter, we took it." The escape pod jettisoned into space, joining dozens of others from the civilian fleet. Daniel watched through the viewport as the Resolute's reactor finally gave out, the ship collapsing in on itself in a controlled implosion that Paolo had programmed as a final act of defiance. Even in death, she would deny the Assembly salvage rights. Yuki Tanaka's ship, the Defiant, pulled alongside their pod, extending docking clamps. Through the viewport, Daniel could see her face, weathered and strong, wearing the same expression every survivor wore when they realized they had lived through something that should have killed them. The galaxy was watching now. Earth was no longer invisible, no longer ignorable. They had paid for attention with blood and fire, but they had been heard. And in a universe built on silence and selective compassion, being heard was its own kind of revolution. The medical bay aboard the Defiant smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. But to Daniel it smelled like life. He sat on a metal examination table while a medic he didn't know stitched the gash above his eyebrow, her hands gentle despite the crude supplies. Around him, survivors from the Resolute were being treated for burns, broken bones, and wounds that would leave scars long after the physical pain faded. Rita lay on a nearby bed, her arm wrapped in synthetic skin grafts, eyes closed but breathing steady. Paolo stood by a viewport, his back to the room, shoulders shaking in a way that told Daniel the chief engineer was finally letting himself feel everything he had held back during the battle. Captain Yuki Tanaka entered without ceremony, carrying 2 cups of something that barely qualified as coffee. She handed one to Daniel and took a seat beside him, her silence more comfortable than any words could have been. They sat like that for several minutes, 2 people who understood that survival sometimes felt heavier than death, because it meant carrying forward the memory of those who didn't make it. "Your crew is asking about you," Yuki finally said, her voice rough from years of commanding ships through impossible situations. "They want to know what happens next." Daniel took a sip of the bitter liquid, letting it ground him in the present moment. "What happens next is we keep moving. The Assembly will send more ships eventually. They can't let this stand without response. Yuki nodded slowly, but something in her expression suggested she knew more than she was saying. The channels have been interesting since your fight. That Valorian diplomat, Kuven, he didn't just submit evidence of the suppressed distress calls. He leaked the full assembly record showing 43 votes over 7 years to deny Earth any assistance. Species we thought were neutral, some we even thought might be sympathetic. They all voted to let us die. Daniel felt the words settle like stones in his chest, each one adding weight to a burden he already carried. But alongside the anger came something unexpected, a strange sense of clarity. Knowing the truth, however brutal, was better than living in false hope. At least now they understood exactly where humanity stood in the galactic order. How many ships do we have? Daniel asked, already thinking ahead to logistics and defense. More than you'd think, Yuki replied with a hint of pride. Word spread fast after your transmission. Colony ships from 11 different settlements have pledged to form a defensive network. We're calling it the Free Human Alliance. Not fancy, but it says what we mean. Daniel looked around the medical bay at faces marked by struggle and loss, but still breathing, still fighting. These weren't the pristine corridors of assembly warships with their advanced medical technology and comfortable certainty. This was humanity stripped to its core, raw and imperfect and absolutely refusing to surrender. In that moment, he understood something profound. They hadn't just survived a battle. They had proven something to themselves and to every human watching across the colonies. They had proven that worth wasn't granted by councils or measured by technological advancement. Worth was claimed through action, through standing up when standing up meant certain death, through caring about each other when the galaxy had decided they weren't worth caring about. A young technician approached hesitantly, someone Daniel didn't recognize from any of the colony rosters. She couldn't have been more than 20, with nervous hands and eyes that had seen too much too soon. Excuse me, Lieutenant Harper. I wanted to thank you. I'm from Jericho. My little brother, he's 7 years old. Because of what you did, because you bought us time, he got on an evacuation ship. He's alive because you decided our lives mattered. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, to say something about duty or tactics or how he was just doing what needed to be done. But the words caught in his throat. This young woman wasn't thanking a soldier or a tactician. She was thanking someone who had seen her humanity when the rest of the galaxy looked away. That responsibility felt more significant than any military rank or strategic victory. What's your name? He asked gently. Emma Okonkwo, she replied. I'm an environmental systems engineer. I want to help. Whatever the Alliance needs, I want to be part of making sure nobody else loses their home. Yuki smiled at that, an expression that carried both sadness and hope. That's what we're building here, Emma. Not just ships and weapons, but a promise. A promise that every human matters, that we protect each other because nobody else will. Over the next hours, Daniel watched as the survivors came together in ways that military training never could have predicted. Paolo, despite his exhaustion, began working with other engineers to assess the defensive capabilities of their makeshift fleet. Rita, arm still healing, started coordinating communication networks between colonies so they could share resources and intelligence. Emma and dozens like her found their places, contributing skills in agriculture, medicine, construction, and 100 other fields that mattered just as much as weapons when building something meant to last. Daniel found himself walking through the Defiance corridors, observing crews from different colonies working side by side. He saw a former corporate executive helping a teenage mechanic repair damaged life support systems. He watched elderly refugees teaching younger generations how to stretch food supplies and purify water, using techniques learned during Earth's darkest years. These people carried trauma in their bones, but they also carried resilience that no assembly species seemed to understand. In the ship's common area, someone had set up a small memorial wall. Photographs, handwritten notes, personal items belonging to those lost in the battle, and those lost long before. Robert Chen's picture was there, along with a note from his sister thanking him for believing humanity deserved better. Daniel added his own contribution, a small metal disc from the Resolute's original commissioning, and stood in silent acknowledgement of every sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. A child's voice broke his reflection. Are you the man who fought the bad ships? Daniel turned to find a boy, perhaps 8 years old, clutching a worn stuffed animal and looking up with eyes that held more understanding than any child should possess. He knelt to meet the boy's gaze. I'm one of many people fighting to keep you safe. What's your name? Thomas, the boy replied. My dad says you're a hero, are you? The question hung in the air, simple and impossible. Daniel thought about all the choices that had led here, the violence and destruction, the lives taken and lives lost. Heroes belonged in stories, clean narratives with clear villains and triumphant endings. This was messier, more complicated, stained with moral ambiguity. I'm just someone who believes you deserve to grow up, Daniel answered honestly. That makes me no different from your father or anyone else here fighting for the same thing. Thomas considered this with the seriousness only children possess. Then we're all heroes, everyone who keeps going even when it's scary. Out of the mouths of children, Daniel thought, came wisdom that adults spent lifetimes trying to articulate. Yes, he agreed. I think you're right. As Thomas ran off to rejoin his family, Yuki appeared at Daniel's side again. The assembly has issued a formal statement, she said quietly. They're calling us terrorists and pirates. They've authorized military action against any human vessels found outside designated zones. Daniel absorbed this information without surprise. Of course they would. Admitting humans had legitimate grievances would mean confronting their own complicity. Easier to paint resistance as criminality than to acknowledge their moral failure. Then we make sure every action we take proves them wrong, Daniel replied. We defend ourselves, we protect our people, but we don't become the monsters they're trying to paint us as. We show the galaxy what humanity really means, not the violence they expect, but the compassion they never anticipated. Yuki's expression shifted into something approaching hope. You're talking about changing hearts and minds. That's a longer war than any military campaign. It's the only war worth fighting, Daniel said. They beat us in technology and resources in numbers, but they can't beat us in determination or heart. Every time they try to crush us and we rise again. Every time they expect us to act like savages and we choose mercy instead. We win, not battles, but something more important. We win the right to define ourselves rather than accepting their definition. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from the bridge. Multiple contacts dropping out of faster-than-light travel, Rita's voice announced over the ship-wide communication. 20 vessels, unknown configuration. They're not assembly standard. Daniel and Yuki rushed to the bridge, joining Rita and Paolo at the tactical stations. The view screen showed an impressive formation of ships, sleek and deadly. Bearing markings Daniel had only seen in classified intelligence reports. These were Valorian warships, belonging to the same species whose diplomat had exposed the assembly's cover-up. An incoming transmission, Rita reported, her voice uncertain. On screen, Daniel ordered.